Some stories from this area stay quiet longer than they should. This is one of them. In April of 1671, inside a meeting house in Taunton, a Wampanoag sachem put his mark to a document most people have never read. The language is startling. He acknowledged the naughtiness of his own heart. He admitted he had taken up arms with evil intent and that he had done so groundlessly. Then, he agreed to surrender every English firearm belonging to his people to be kept by the government of Plymouth for as long as they saw reason. That document still exists. The ground where it was signed still exists. And 4 years later, the bloodiest war in 17th century New England began. Most of us were taught a simpler story. We were told that King Philip's War started in June of 1675 after the murder of a Christian Indian named John Sassaman and the trial of 3 Wampanoag men. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, then led an uprising that nearly destroyed English settlement across southern New England. That version is not false. It is incomplete. The more decisive break had already happened. In the spring of 1671, rumors reached Plymouth that Metacom was gathering arms and receiving warriors from outside his territory. English leaders decided the threat had to be confronted. They summoned him to Taunton. Metacom arrived with a large party of warriors, faces and bodies painted, bows and guns ready. He waited several miles outside the town and sent messengers asking the English to come to him. They refused. Eventually, under the protection of hostages, he agreed to enter the meeting house. What happened next was carefully staged. The English sat on one side of the room, the Wampanoag sat on the other. Both sides were armed. Massachusetts Bay commissioners were present as mediators, but the written terms were controlled by the English. Under those conditions, Metacom and several of his counselors signed the submission. The language was not his. It was the language of public self-condemnation drafted for him to accept. He was required to say that the fault lay in the naughtiness of his own heart and that the English had given him no provocation. Then came the practical demand. All English arms were to be turned over. The weapons Metacom's party had carried into the meeting house were surrendered on the spot. He promised the rest would follow. Almost none did. Within weeks, the Plymouth court declared the arms already in its possession justly forfeit and ordered them distributed among the English towns. The temporary safekeeping promised in the document became permanent confiscation. A second confrontation followed in September. Metacom was again required to acknowledge offense and pay costs. The pattern was clear. English authorities were no longer treating the relationship as an alliance between equals. They were treating it as subordination. We do not have Metacom's private account of that day in Taunton. Every detailed surviving description was written by English hands. The absence itself is part of the record. The stronger party controlled both the language and the memory of the event. Once the arms were gone and the language of guilt was on the permanent record, the options available to Metacom narrowed sharply. The reciprocal alliance that had existed since the time of his father, Massasoit, no longer functioned. 4 years later, when the Sassaman crisis arrived, the conditions for total war were already in place. The meeting house where this happened no longer stands, but the ground does. It is the same ground that is still the civic and spiritual heart of Taunton, Church Green, the continuous site of First Parish Church. The confrontation that helped close the last path to coexistence took place on land you can still walk. Most people who pass through that green have never been told what was decided there. The document that recorded the decision is still readable. The language of forced confession is still there on the page. The order that turned temporary safekeeping into permanent forfeiture is still in the colonial records. And the war that followed still carries the name of the man who put his mark to that paper in Taunton. The story we usually hear begins in 1675. The more decisive story began 4 years earlier, in a room on ground that is still the center of the city, when one people forced another to speak the language of guilt and to surrender the means of defense. That is what happened in Taunton. The paper still exists. The ground still exists. The consequences followed. The document is still there. The ground is still there. That's the part that stays with you.